So I'm glad you're here, and we'll get rolling. A couple of things to think about when we think about communion. In the culture in which communion began, when Jesus instituted it, and even before, really got to understand that who you ate with defined who you were. So your meal was a social definition of who you were in the world. And we don't have that as heavily today as they did back then. Maybe a little bit. When I visited Aaron in UCLA, when he was going to UCLA, we went out to dinner one night. And we went out to dinner in a restaurant that was a pretty nice restaurant. But next to our restaurant was a restaurant where all the Ferraris and the Mercedes would drive in, and a valet person would, usher the person in. We could never eat in that restaurant, right? It was overpriced, it was hoity-toity, and you had to be somebody to eat there. So we still have certain things like that happen today. But in their world, who you ate with defined where you fit into the social fabric of the day. So that meal sharing had huge power to position who you were in the world and who you shared meals with. And so when you begin to think about communion as which world am I participating in, and how does this shared meal shape my individual and collective persona in the world, it begins to unravel the mystery of this meal that we share. I think that's a huge one. And for kids, I try to help them think about, when you're in school, I was this way, you probably were too, right? I had a certain group of kids that I ate lunch with every time, right? And you would never eat lunch with those kids, and they would never eat lunch with you. In elementary school, you're already kind of becoming based on who you eat lunch with. And it's the same thing on Sunday morning. We are becoming who we share this meal with. That's number one. That's a good one to hang on to. The second one is that this meal, the communion meal that we share, requires practice. That this weekly practice of coming together is a way, I think, of kind of stitching your life to both the life of the community and the life of the holy. So think of communion as a spiritual practice, that when you come up, and a spiritual practice is meaningless unless you invest meaning in it, right? So I could eat bread and drink wine any old day. In fact, I do a lot of that at home, right? We did it at the Wine and Tapas. So wine and bread is nothing in particular unless you invest meaning in the wine and bread. So even if Holly or me or somebody else says, this bread means this, it requires you to actually come forward and think, yes, this bread means this for me. This wine means this for me. So it's a spiritual practice in that you come weekly to kind of stitch your life into something holy and to give it meaning. So practice makes perfect. So when you do communion, think of it as a spiritual practice when you do that, whatever that takes for you. And the stitching part, I would, that's the one great thing about spiritual practices is that when you stitch something together, one stitch will not hold fabric together. If my pants were held together by one stitch, it wouldn't work, right? That thin, weak thread that you could snap with no problem only works when it's stitched over and over and over and over and over again. And once that method happens, then there's some strength to the bond. And that's the way spiritual practices are, like a thin thread that binds you to the holy, but that thin thread will snap with no problem unless the practice is repeated like a sewing machine over and over and over again. So think about communion as a practice, a spiritual practice in that way. All right? The next idea to think about when you, kind of these global thoughts on the practices of communion, is that God for the common good. What communion is now looks so much different than what it was when it first got started that I don't know that we really get this concept. But when communities came together to break bread, they didn't do it in the temple. It wasn't done in sacred space. It was done in common space, around a common table. And the emphasis there is that the common life that we lead is where the sacred is invested. And they didn't have to go down to the temple for the temple rituals. They actually broke bread originally in people's homes. And the reason why it's hard for us to remember that is now that we've stuck it back in the temple again, right? So now you come to church and you do communion. And so partly you kind of have to get through that notion that this meal is a meal that sits within the common experience of the human condition, and to kind of frame it that way, rather than elevating it up as we do. And I think we make a mistake in the way in which we kind of elevate the meal. It should be really felt like it's a common meal. So I think that's a big piece of the puzzle there, that this meal occurs within the common experience of humanity. Martin Luther, I use this line over and over again because I only know a couple lines from Martin Luther, so I got to use them over and over again. And then you forget that I know them, and you think, well, he really knows a lot of Martin Luther. But I'm actually using the same line over and over and over again. Martin Luther used to say that he sees God in the bread and the wine held up by the priest on Sunday morning, but he also sees God in his soup at lunch when he goes home. And that's the kind of way you want to think about this. These are common elements that you have every day, and the idea is the sacred is actually woven into common. Okay? And then taking it for a test drive, that's just for the kids. We were going to have them actually practice it. All right? Any comments or questions on that? Yeah, Julie?
Well, the first one, it says you are what you eat.
Yeah.
It seems like, I'm sorry if I missed that, because you kind of talked about who you eat it with.
Ah, good point.
But you are what you eat. I wasn't sure if that is
I
something
think
slightly different.
It's great. I would say both. You are who you eat with, and you are what you eat. When we look at the actual element of bread and wine, what do those kind of represent? Why is it bread that we eat together? I mean, why isn't it grapes and Jello and fish sticks? Or maybe fish would be better, right? Jesus was a kind of fisher guy.
Green Jello, that's Lutheran.
Green Jello would be Lutheran, you know. So what is it with the bread thing, and what is it with the wine thing? And so we will cover that. What you actually consume has some meaning to it as well. I remember, I don't know if you guys remember, but there was always these debates when I grew up in the Missouri Synod, and when we switched like from wafers to real bread, there's all this controversy, or we went from wine to grape juice, people were getting their panties in an uproar. You know, people get upset about anything. So what you actually consume matters to some people. Yeah, Eva?
Bread is supposed to be the staple food, and I guess Jesus had bread in his Last Supper.
Right. And we're going to learn why is bread so powerful. And you're right. It's she already gave you a hint. It's a staple food.
Yes.
It's not the food of the wealthy. It's the food of what's common for everybody to share. All right. So let's switch to the next slide here. It's marvelous PowerPoint presentation. Communion, we call it a sacrament. And sacrament is basically a sacred thing we do together. So, like I told you before, that you invest meaning in it so that it becomes a sacred experience. And a sacred, you know, you can think about, for each of you, probably there are sacred places for you, right? And if I asked you to say, what does a sacred place look like for you? And my guess is it would be that thin place where you feel like you're drawn into something greater than you are. It could be out in the wilderness. You know, for me, when I go backpacking, there's something about, you know, just being out in the middle of nowhere that all of a sudden you have this sort of an experience of being drawn into something greater than you are. And I would call that a holy kind of experience. Some people have that just sitting silently. They define that as holy. Everybody has their own way of, where is this place in which you meet the holy? And a sacrament is supposed to be a place where you can meet the holy. And a thin place where you experience the holy. And my guess is that doesn't happen for everybody every week, but that's the intent, that we create a thin place for that. So that's what a sacrament is. The other thing, I think, is, so it connects us, and I write it this way because I think it's important to think of it this way. It connects us to what we think is holy and godlike and forever true. You know, there's rituals in every religion. This is one particular practice that we think connects us to that which is holy for us. And that's important, that we assign some meaning to it. One example of why I think I put that in there is because when I was a small child, and I was small at one point, I wasn't as huge as I am now. I grew up in the church, like Emily. Emily grew up in the church too? Did you?
Yeah.
Yeah. So my parents were deeply part of the church. So I was a janitor at the church. I was a gardener at the church. I did everything there. And they, after communion, I would go in where the women were cleaning the cups, and I'd often clean the communion cups after church. And there was always this debate, right, about what to do with the leftover wine. And how many of you are in the Catholic tradition? Anybody in the Catholic tradition know what they do with the wine that's left over after communion? Bud, you remember?
Well, they could keep it as a reserved sacrament, or they have to drink it all.
Right, so the priest either finishes it off, usually the priest will finish it off, and then you'll see them sometimes, I've seen them literally wipe out
Oh,
you know,
yes.
they don't want any of that left over because it's so sacred that they're handling it differently. And
Which was why they never gave the wine to the lay people. For fear they were going to spill some of it, keep
Oh,
it
wow.
around.
yeah, so that's taking an element and saying the thing is so sacred that we can't mess around with it.
Yeah.
And what they would do, they wouldn't actually pour it down the sink, because God forbid we would pour Jesus down into the sewer system, right? So they would not do that in the church that I grew up in. They would take it outside and pour it into the ground. And so when I came, I don't know, when I got older, I remember having to get over the hump, because I grew up that way of saying, well, now when we're done with communion, we just, down the sink it goes. Because,
They pour it out the back.
do they really?
They pour it in the ground, but
Crying out loud, so it's still in here today. Rah, rah for you. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's still just wine, right? It's still just wine and grape juice. It's because you've invested meaning in it that it becomes something other. It doesn't become that on its own. So just keep that in mind. I didn't realize you were still doing that. You're pouring it on the ground. All right. The next thing is to think about communion sort of like poetry. And poetry, the reason I love poetry and poetry frustrates me at the same time is that poetry has layers of meaning that disclose itself the longer you engage in the piece of poetry, right? How many of you have you ever memorized one poem and held on it? And has that poem kind of morphed as you matured with that poem when you have it in your head? Poetry has the ability to have many different layers, and those layers reveal themselves differently as you mature and change. That's what communion should be for you. It should be kind of poetic, that the creative reflection on this experience will change over time as you go through changes in your own life. So allow it to be that. Don't think, communion means this, so when I go up, this is what it's going to mean for me. It washes away my sin, if that's the way you think of it, and then that's got to do it like that every time. Well, let it evolve as you evolve as well. Okay? All right, so let's take a look at the different elements, some of what we call some of the poetic elements of communion itself. And let's start with the bread and the wine. And the first thing I want you to make note of is that, this goes back to your question, Julie, it is bread and wine. And why bread and why wine? Or what I'm going to say, I want you to focus more on the notion of cup than wine. The bread was, as Eva mentioned before, bread was a base element that everybody could share. In their time and place, the one thing that happened oftentimes in the sacrificial system was the distribution of meat, which was very rare and would be doled out depending on who had the highest place in the social fabric of the day. So there wasn't a lot of meat around, so when you had meat, it's very special. And when you get invited over to meat that has been sacrificed to the gods, it's like this big barbecue. And so meat distribution and meat consumption was linked to sacrifice in Roman times, and who got to eat meat was sort of a who's on the pecking order. And so when Jesus kind of, in a sense, institutes communion, or at least the Jesus movement, for lack of a better way to think about it, they shifted from who gets to eat meat in the sacrificial system. And you remember, Paul was arguing all the time about, we're not sure we want to even eat the meat of sacrifices, because Paul was saying, not that it's evil to do it, but we're not going to participate in this pecking order system. So that's what Paul was fighting against. He would say, we're a bread people. We're people that bread can be shared evenly with everybody. And so when we